Sometimes life strips away everything you thought you had, leaving you standing at a stranger's gate with nothing but your pride to swallow. We've all faced moments when desperation makes us brave enough to ask for help from the last person we ever thought would listen. When Josie Mallory's father died, he left her with debts that could bury a town and winter closing in like a fist. Every ranch door slammed shut until she found herself begging at the gate of Elias Boone, giant of a man with stone-cold eyes and a reputation that scared grown men. "Please take me. I'll do anything," she whispered through tears. His answer changed everything. "Will you marry me?" Not for love, but for survival. He needed a wife to keep his land. She needed shelter before the snow claimed her life. But when you share a roof with someone, when you see them rescue orphaned calves and mend your broken things without asking, something deeper than duty starts to grow. What happens when their year-long bargain becomes the greatest love either of them has ever known? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind had teeth in rawhide flats, the kind that bit through wool and leather and found the tender places where hope used to live. Josie Mallory pulled her father's old coat tighter as she walked the main street, feeling the weight of curious stares from shop windows. 3 weeks had passed since they'd buried Samuel Mallory in the rocky ground behind the church, and the whole town seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see what would become of his daughter. Rawhide Flats wasn't much to look at, a collection of weathered buildings huddled against the Montana wind like frightened animals. But it had been home for all of Josie's 24 years, and she'd never imagined leaving it. The general store where she'd bought penny candy as a child, the church where her mother had sung in the choir before consumption took her 10 years back, the small cabin on Willow Creek where she'd nursed her father through his final, painful months. These places held every memory she treasured. Now the bank wanted to take it all. Josie's fingers traced the crumpled notice in her coat pocket, the paper worn soft from her anxious handling. 60 days to settle her father's debts or lose everything. The medical bills alone could choke a horse. Dr. Patterson had been kind enough not to press for immediate payment while her father was dying, but kindness didn't pay for medicine or put food on his family's table. She'd tried everything she could think of. The millinery shop had no need for another seamstress. The hotel restaurant couldn't afford extra help. Mrs. Henderson at the boarding house had looked genuinely sorry when she explained that her own daughter needed the housekeeping position Josie had hoped for. Door after door, the same gentle rejections, the same sympathetic smiles that offered no real solutions. The men's work paid better ranch work, cattle driving, the hard labor that built the West, but no respectable outfit would hire a woman for such things. Not when winter was coming and they needed hands who could handle the brutal, cold, and dangerous animals without becoming a liability. All except one. Elias Boone's spread lay 15 miles northeast of town, a vast kingdom of grass and cattle that stretched to the horizon. Folks said he ran 10,000 head on land that had been in his family since before the railroad came through. They also said he was a hard man, silent as winter stones and twice as cold. Josie had seen him in town perhaps a dozen times in her life, a giant of a man who towered over other cowboys like a mountain over hills. His dark hair and weathered face spoke of long days under the sun, and his eyes held the kind of distance that came from seeing too much of life's harsh truths. The stories about Elias Boone were the stuff of saloon whispers and church social gossip. Some said he'd killed a man in Colorado and fled north to escape justice. Others claimed he'd been a soldier in some forgotten war, that the scars on his hands came from battles no decent person should know about. The kindest rumors simply painted him as a man broken by grief. His young wife had died in childbirth years ago, taking their baby with her, and he'd never been the same. What everyone agreed on was that he was fair in his business dealings, paid his hands well, and kept to himself. His ranch, the Double B, was the largest and most prosperous in 3 counties. If any operation could afford to take on an extra hand, even a desperate woman with more determination than experience, it would be his. The ride out to the Double B had cost Josie her last $2 for a horse and wagon from the livery, money she couldn't spare but had to spend. She'd dressed in her father's old work clothes, hoping to look capable and practical rather than feminine and fragile. Her hands shook as she held the reins, not from the cold, but from the knowledge that this was her final chance. The Boone Ranch house sat in a valley protected by rolling hills, a solid structure of logs and stone that spoke of permanence and prosperity. Smoke rose from the chimney, and she could see cattle dotting the grassland that stretched in every direction. Corrals and outbuildings clustered around the main house like planets around the sun, everything built with the careful planning of a man who intended his work to last generations. Josie pulled up at the main gate, her courage faltering as she saw the massive figure emerge from the barn. Elias Boone stood at least 6.5 feet tall, his shoulders broad enough to block the sun. He wore simple working clothes, denim and flannel and leather butt on his frame. They looked like armor. His face was all hard angles and stern lines, the kind of face that had forgotten how to smile. He approached her wagon with the measured pace of a man who never hurried, his boots crunching on the frost-covered ground. When he looked up at her, his eyes were the color of storm clouds, gray and unreadable. "Miss Mallory." His voice was deep and quiet, the kind that didn't need volume to command attention. "Heard about your father. My condolences." "Thank you, Mr. Boone." Josie's voice came out smaller than she'd intended. She cleared her throat and tried again. "I came to ask about work." Something shifted in his expression, not quite surprise, but a subtle tightening around his eyes. "Ranch work?" "Any work. I'm not afraid of hard labor, and I learn quick. I can cook, clean, mend, tend animals, whatever you need." The words tumbled out faster than she'd planned, desperation making her voice climb higher. "I won't ask for much in wages, just enough to—" "No." The single word hit her like a physical blow. Josie felt her last hope crumble, felt the weight of 60 days and impossible debts settle on her shoulders like stones. "Please." The word escaped before pride could stop it. "Mr. Boone, I'll do anything. I'm strong, I'm willing, I won't cause trouble." Or, "Miss Mallory." He held up a hand, and she fell silent. "It's not about your character or abilities. I don't hire women for ranch work. Too dangerous, too hard on someone your size. But winter's coming. We'll be moving cattle through snow and ice, dealing with wolves and blizzards that can kill a man in minutes. I won't have your death on my conscience." Tears burned her eyes, and she blinked them back furiously. She would not cry in front of this man, would not give him reason to see her as weak and feminine. But the tears came anyway, hot tracks down her cold cheeks. "I understand," she whispered. "Thank you for your time." She started to turn the wagon around, defeat settling in her chest like lead, when his voice stopped her. "Wait." Josie looked back, to find him studying her with those unreadable gray eyes. Something had changed in his expression, a thoughtfulness that hadn't been there before. "You said you'd do anything." She nodded, not trusting her voice. Elias was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving from her face to the horizon and back again. When he spoke, his words were carefully measured, as if he were feeling his way through unfamiliar territory. "There's something I need, not ranch work, but—" He paused, seeming to wrestle with the words. "It's complicated. I don't understand. My father left specific terms in his will, conditions that must be met for me to keep this land." His jaw tightened, and she could see that whatever he was about to say cost him something. "I need a wife." The words hung in the cold air between them like smoke. Josie stared at him, certain she'd misheard. "I'm sorry, what?" "Marriage, legal and binding. The will specifies that I must be married by my 35th birthday, or the land passes to my cousin in Denver." His voice remained steady, but his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. "That's 6 months from now." Josie's mind reeled. Of all the things she'd imagined he might say, this had never occurred to her. Marriage to a stranger, to this silent giant of a man who supposedly had blood on his hands and ice in his veins. "Why me?" she managed to ask. Because you need something I can provide, and I need something you can provide. It would be a business arrangement, nothing more. You'd have a home, security, enough money to pay your father's debts. I'd keep my land. For how long? A year. After that, we could end it quietly if that's what you wanted. Or, he shrugged, the gesture oddly vulnerable on such a large man. We'd see. The practical part of Josie's mind, the part that had balanced her father's books and stretched every penny through his illness, began calculating. A year of security, debt paid, a roof over her head through the brutal Montana winter. It was more than she'd dared hope for when she'd driven out here this morning. But the woman in her, the part that had dreamed of love and children and a marriage built on tenderness, recoiled from the cold practicality of it. What would people say? That Elias Boone finally found a woman brave enough to have him, a ghost of something that might have been humor flickered in his eyes. They're not wrong. Despite everything, Josie almost smiled. There was something unexpectedly gentle in his dry observation, a self-awareness that spoke of intelligence beneath the intimidating exterior. I don't know you, she said. No, you don't. But you know I'm honest in my dealings, and I pay my debts. Ask anyone in town, my word is good. It was true. For all the dark rumors about Elias Boone's past, no one questioned his integrity in business. When he said he'd do something, it got done. When he owed money, it got paid. This is crazy, Josie whispered. Yes, he agreed, but sometimes crazy is all we have left. The wind picked up, sending leaves skittering across the ground between them. Josie pulled her coat tighter and studied this man who was offering her salvation in the strangest possible form. He wasn't handsome in the conventional sense. His features were too harsh, his manner too intimidating. But there was something solid about him, something that spoke of bedrock reliability beneath the forbidding exterior. And she was out of options. If I said yes, she began slowly, what would you expect from me? To be my legal wife, to live in my house. Beyond that, he shrugged again, we'd figure it out as we went. And if I wanted to leave after a year, you'd be free to go, with enough money to start over wherever you chose. The offer was impossible, impractical, and exactly what she needed. Josie closed her eyes and thought of her father's grave, of the debts that would follow her no matter where she went, of the approaching winter that could kill her as surely as any bullet. When she opened her eyes, Elias was still watching her with that patient, unreadable expression. When would this happen? Soon. The legal paperwork needs to be filed, and winter doesn't wait for anyone's convenience. Josie took a deep breath, tasting the sharp air and the promise of snow it carried. In 6 months, she would be 25 years old. She'd spent her entire adult life caring for her dying father, watching her youth slip away one medical bill at a time. Maybe it was time to be practical instead of romantic, to choose security over sentiment. All right, she said, the words coming out steady and sure despite the chaos in her heart. I'll marry you, Mr. Boone. Something flickered across his face, relief, perhaps, or satisfaction at a problem solved. Elias, he said, if we're going to be married, you should call me Elias. Elias, she repeated, testing the name on her tongue. It felt strange and formal, like trying on clothes that didn't quite fit. We'll go to town tomorrow morning, talk to the preacher, file the papers. He paused, and for the first time since she'd arrived, he looked uncertain. Are you sure about this, Miss Mallory? Josie, she said, echoing his earlier correction. No, I'm not sure about anything, but I'm sure I don't have a choice. He nodded slowly, understanding passing between them like a handshake. They were two people backed into corners, making the best deal they could with the cards life had dealt them. I'll take care of your father's debts, Elias said. Consider it part of the arrangement. Relief flooded through her so suddenly it made her dizzy. Thank you. Drive careful going back to town. Storms coming in tonight. Josie gathered the reins, still not quite believing what had just happened. As she turned the wagon toward the road, she glanced back to see Elias still standing by the gate, his massive frame silhouetted against the darkening sky. Tomorrow, this intimidating stranger would become her husband, The thought should have terrified her. Instead, for the first time in months, she felt something that might have been hope. The next morning came grey and cold, with frost painting the windows of Josie's cabin in delicate patterns that would have been beautiful if they didn't remind her that winter was bearing down like a freight train. She dressed in her only good, dark blue wool that had been her mother's sand, braided her brown hair with fingers that trembled from nerves rather than cold. By 8 o'clock, she heard the sound of wheels on the frozen road. Through her window, she saw Elias driving a sturdy wagon, his massive frame making the vehicle look smaller than it was. He'd cleaned up for the occasion, his dark hair was combed back, and he wore a black suit that stretched across his broad shoulders. The sight of him dressed for their wedding sent a flutter of panic through her chest. "Good morning," he said simply when she opened the door. "Good morning." The words felt formal and strange. In less than an hour, this man would be her husband. Elias helped her into the wagon with surprising gentleness, his large hands careful as they steadied her. They rode toward town in relative silence, the only sounds the creak of wheels and the steady rhythm of horse hooves on hard ground. Josie found herself stealing glances at his profile, the strong jaw, the serious grey eyes focused on the road ahead, the way he held the reins with competent ease. "Nervous?" he asked without looking at her. "Terrified," she admitted. That earned her a glance, and she caught something that might have been sympathy in his expression. "Me too." The confession surprised her. She'd assumed a man like Elias Boone, successful, experienced, intimidating, would approach even marriage with the same calm confidence he brought to everything else. "Really? Last time I got married, I was 22 and thought I knew everything." His voice carried a weight that spoke of old pain. "This time, I know how much I don't know." Josie wanted to ask about his first wife, about the grief that folks said had changed him, but something in his manner warned her away from the subject. There would be time for such conversations later if there was a later. The town was just waking up when they arrived, shopkeepers sweeping their stoops and early customers beginning their daily routines. A few people paused to stare as they passed, and Josie could practically hear the gossip that would be flying before noon. Samuel Mallory's daughter marrying Elias Boone, tongues would wag for months. The church sat at the end of Main Street, a simple white building with a bell tower that had called the faithful to worship for 30 years. Reverend Matthews was expecting them, Elias having sent word the night before. The elderly preacher greeted them at the door with kind eyes and a gentle smile that did nothing to ease Josie's nerves. "Miss Mallory, Mr. Boone, a blessed day for a wedding despite the weather. Thank you for agreeing to perform the ceremony on such short notice," Elias said. "The Lord's work doesn't wait for convenience." Reverend Matthews studied them both with the perceptive gaze of a man who'd married couples for 3 decades. "Shall we proceed?" The inside of the church was dim and quiet, rows of empty pews stretching toward the altar, where a simple wooden cross caught the pale morning light. Josie had attended services here every Sunday of her childhood, had sung hymns from these pews and listened to countless sermons about love and faith and the sanctity of marriage. Now she was about to make vows she wasn't sure she could keep to a man she barely knew. Mrs. Matthews appeared from the vestry to serve as witness, her grey hair pinned in a neat bun and her dress pressed for the occasion. She smiled warmly at Josie, but there was a question in her eyes that spoke of concern for the young woman she'd watched grow up. "Shall we begin?" Reverend Matthews asked. They stood before the altar, Elias towering over her even more than usual in the sacred space. The preacher opened his worn Bible and began the familiar words that Josie had heard at dozens of weddings, words that had always seemed romantic and hopeful when spoken over couples who looked at each other with stars in their eyes. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." The ceremony felt both eternal and rushed, the words washing over Josie like water over stone. She heard herself respond at the proper moments, heard Elias's deep voice making the same promises she was making. When it came time for rings, he produced a simple gold band from his vest pocket. "It was my mother's," he said quietly, his fingers gentle as he slipped it onto her hand. The ring was slightly too large, but it was beautiful in its simplicity, worn smooth by years of wear, warm from being carried against his heart. The gesture touched something deep in Josie's chest, a recognition that this might be a practical arrangement, but it wasn't without meaning. When Reverend Matthews pronounced them husband and wife, Elias looked down at her with an expression she couldn't read. For a moment, she thought he might kiss her. It was traditional, expected, but instead he simply nodded, as if sealing a business agreement. "Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Boone," the preacher said, shaking both their hands. "May the Lord bless your union." Mrs. Boone. The name felt foreign in Josie's mind, like a coat that belonged to someone else. She was no longer Josie Mallory, the spinster daughter caring for her dying father. She was Mrs. Elias Boone, wife to one of the most successful ranchers in 3 counties. The transformation felt impossible. They signed the marriage certificate in the church office, their names flowing together on the official document that would change both their lives. Elias's handwriting was bold and precise, while hers looked small and uncertain beside it. "I'll file this with the county clerk today," Reverend Matthews assured them. "You're legally married in the eyes of God and the territory of Montana." Outside the church, the day seemed brighter despite the grey sky. A few townspeople had gathered, drawn by curiosity about the sudden wedding. Josie recognized the banker, Mr. Carlyle, his face showing surprise and calculation as he processed what this marriage might mean for her father's debts. "Mrs. Henderson's expecting us for dinner," Elias said as he helped her back into the wagon. "Figured you might want to celebrate somewhere nicer than my kitchen." The boarding house dining room was the closest thing Rawhide Flats had to fine dining, and Mrs. Henderson had outdone herself for the occasion. The table was set with her best china, and she'd prepared roast chicken with all the fixings. A few other guests joined them. Patterson, the banker, and 2 other couples from Townell, curious to observe this unlikely union. The conversation was polite but strained, full of careful compliments and veiled questions. Everyone wanted to know how this courtship had developed so quickly, why 2 people who'd barely spoken before were suddenly married. Elias fielded the inquiries with diplomatic non-answers, while Josie mostly smiled and let him handle the social navigation. "Such a whirlwind romance," Mrs. Patterson observed, her eyes bright with curiosity. "You must have been quite smitten with each other." "Sometimes you know," Elias said simply, his hand covering Josie's on the table. The gesture was possessive and protective, though his skin was warm against hers. "No point waiting when you're sure." After dinner, they drove back to the ranch in the growing dusk. The reality of what she'd done was beginning to sink in. She was married, moving into a stranger's house, bound to a man she didn't know for better or worse. The ring on her finger felt heavy, a constant reminder of vows she'd made but didn't fully understand. "Second thoughts?" Elias asked, noticing her silence. "Third and fourth thoughts," she admitted. "You?" "Every minute since I asked you." He glanced at her, something vulnerable flickering in his expression. "But I meant what I said to Mrs. Patterson. Sometimes practical is the same as right." The ranch house looked different in the evening light, less imposing and more welcoming. Smoke rose from the chimney, and warm light spilled from the windows. Elias had left a fire burning in the hearth, and the main room was comfortable despite its masculine simplicity. "I'll show you around," he said, suddenly seeming as uncertain as she felt. The house was larger than it had appeared from outside, with a main room that served as both parlor and dining area, a kitchen that was clearly designed for practical use rather than socializing, and 3 bedrooms down a short hallway. Elias showed her to the largest of the spare rooms, where her few belongings waited in a small trunk. "This is yours," he said. "I'm down the hall if you need anything." The room was simply furnished but comfortable, with a large bed covered in a quilt that looked handmade, a dresser, and a window that looked out over the rolling grassland. Someone, probably Elias, had put fresh flowers in a vase on the dresser, a gesture that seemed touchingly incongruous from such a large, stern man. "Thank you," she said, "for everything. I know this isn't what either of us planned, but I'm grateful." "Don't thank me yet. You haven't lived with me long enough to know if it's a blessing or a curse." There was something almost like humor in his voice, and Josie found herself smiling despite her nerves. "I guess we'll find out together." That night, lying in a strange bed in a strange house, next to a room where her husband was presumably sleeping, Josie stared at the ceiling and wondered what she'd gotten herself into. The ring on her finger caught the moonlight streaming through the window, a circle of gold that bound her to a man she was only beginning to know. Through the thin walls, she could hear small sounds, the creak of floorboards, the rustle of fabric, the quiet movements of someone else adjusting to changed circumstances. Elias was as wakeful as she was, probably wrestling with his own questions about their bargain. They were married now, legally and officially, bound together by necessity and hope. Tomorrow would bring the first day of learning to live as husband and wife, of discovering whether practical could become something more, or whether they would simply endure each other until their year was up. Josie touched the ring again, thinking of the woman who had worn it before her, Elias's mother, who had probably married for love and raised her son in this same house. What would she think of this arrangement, this practical union born of desperation rather than affection? Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and reminding her that winter was coming whether they were ready or not. She had shelter now, security, a name that carried respect in 3 counties. She had married a stranger, but she was no longer alone. It would have to be enough. Josie woke to the sound of roosters and the smell of coffee, both foreign experiences in her small cabin where she'd been the one to brew the morning cup. Pale sunlight filtered through unfamiliar curtains, and for a disorienting moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then the gold ring caught the light, and everything came flooding back: the wedding, the vows, the careful distance Elias had maintained as he'd shown her to this room. She dressed quickly in her simplest work dress and braided her hair, then made her way to the kitchen where she found Elias standing at the stove, already dressed for the day's work. He looked up when she entered, his grey eyes unreadable in the morning light. "Coffee's ready," he said, nodding toward the pot. "Hope you don't mind it strong." "Strong is good." Josie poured herself a cup, noting that he'd set out a second mug without being asked. Small courtesies, but they suggested consideration beneath his stern exterior. They sat at the kitchen table in awkward silence, both wrestling with the strangeness of sharing morning routines with a virtual stranger. Josie studied her husband over the rim of her cup, taking in details she'd been too nervous to notice yesterday. His hands were scarred and calloused from years of hard work, but they held the delicate china cup with surprising care. His dark hair showed threads of silver at the temples, and lines around his eyes spoke of long days, squinting into sun and wind. "What time do you usually eat breakfast?" she asked, searching for safe conversational ground. "Dawn, mostly. Ranch work doesn't wait for convenience." He glanced at her, and she caught a flicker of uncertainty. "But I can adjust if you prefer different hours. I'm used to early mornings. Papa needed his medicine at first light, and I got in the habit of rising with the sun." Something softened in his expression at the mention of her father. He was a good man, honest in his dealings, fair with his customers. He was. The simple acknowledgement eased something tight in Josie's chest. "Thank you for saying so." After breakfast, Elias showed her around the ranch proper, the barns and corrals, the bunkhouse where his hired hands lived, the various outbuildings that supported the operation. Everything was well maintained and efficiently organized, evidence of careful planning and attention to detail. "How many men do you employ?" Josie asked as they walked between the corrals. 8 year-round, 12 during roundup and drive seasons. Good men, mostly been with me for years. He paused by a fence where several horses stood in the morning sun. "They know you're my wife now, but they might be shy around you at first. They're not used to a woman on the property." "I understand." Josie watched the horses, admiring their obvious health and good condition. "They're beautiful animals. Bred them myself. Takes patience, but it's worth the effort when you get results like these." There was pride in his voice, the first real emotion she'd heard from him since their awkward wedding dinner. Here, talking about his work and his animals, Elias seemed more at ease, more himself. "Could I help with anything? I know my way around horses, and I'm good with sick animals." He studied her for a moment, as if weighing her capabilities. "We'll see. Ranch work is different from keeping chickens and a milk cow." It wasn't dismissive, exactly, but it wasn't encouraging either. Josie felt the familiar sting of being underestimated because of her size and gender. She'd spent 3 years nursing her father through a wasting illness, managing their small household, and handling the financial chaos of mounting medical bills. She was stronger than she looked. But this wasn't the time to argue. She was the newcomer here, the interloper in Elias's carefully ordered world. She would have to prove herself gradually, earn his trust and respect through actions rather than words. The day settled into an uncomfortable rhythm of polite distance. Elias went about his usual work while Josie explored the house, familiarizing herself with the kitchen and trying to determine what domestic improvements she could make without overstepping boundaries. The place was clean but spare, functional rather than comfortable. It needed a woman's touch curtains, cushions, the small comforts that turned a house into a home. She found her mother's recipe book in her trunk and spent the afternoon planning meals that would use the supplies in Elias's well-stocked pantry. Cooking had always been her solace, the one domestic skill where she truly excelled. Perhaps she could win her new husband's approval through his stomach, if nothing else. When evening came, she had a pot roast waiting, with vegetables from the root cellar and fresh bread that filled the house with warm, yeasty fragrance. Elias arrived as the sun was setting, his boots heavy on the porch steps. "Smells good in here," he said, hanging his hat by the door. "I hope you're hungry. I made enough for an army." "Ranch appetite," he said simply, but there was something approving in his tone. They ate by lamplight, the meal more comfortable than breakfast had been. Elias complimented the cooking briefly, but sincerely, and Josie felt a small glow of satisfaction. This, at least, she could do well. "Tell me about the ranch," she said as they lingered over coffee. "How long has it been in your family?" "My grandfather started it in 1847, came out from Missouri with nothing but determination and a wagon full of stubbornness." A ghost of a smile flickered across Elias's face. "Built the original cabin where the bunkhouse stands now, fought Indians and weather and everything else the territory could throw at him." "And your father?" "Expanded it, added land, improved the breeding stock, built this house." His expression grew more guarded. "He was a hard man, but fair. Expected perfection and usually got it." "Is that where you learned to be so?" Josie caught herself before saying, "intimidating," settling on "focused" instead. "Probably. Hard to say where nature ends and upbringing begins." They talked until the fire burned low, sharing careful stories about their pasts. Josie told him about her mother's illness, about the slow years of watching her father's health fail. Elias spoke briefly about his time in the army, though he offered few details about what he'd done or where he'd served. When they finally said goodnight, the awkwardness had eased into something more manageable. No comfort, exactly, but not the painful tension of the morning either. "Thank you for dinner," Elias said at her bedroom door. "It's been a long time since this house had proper cooking." "You're welcome. I'll try to have breakfast ready by dawn." "You don't have to." "I want to." The words came out more firmly than she'd intended. "I need to feel useful, Elias. Cooking is something I can do well." He studied her face in the dim hallway light, and she had the sense he was seeing her clearly for the first time. "All right. But don't feel obligated to change your whole life around my schedule. We both have adjusting to do." After he disappeared into his room, Josie prepared for bed with a lighter heart than she'd expected. The day had been strange and difficult, full of small awkwardnesses and careful negotiations, but it hadn't been the disaster she'd feared. Elias was reserved and intimidating, but he wasn't cruel or unkind. There was gentleness in him, buried beneath layers of caution and old pain. As she brushed her hair and changed into her nightgown, Josie found herself thinking about the woman who had occupied this room before her if anyone had. Had Elias's first wife lived in this house? Had she cooked in that kitchen, tended the same garden, looked out these same windows at the rolling grassland? The questions would have to wait. There was too much history between these walls, too many ghosts and memories that she wasn't ready to navigate. For now, it was enough that she had a roof over her head and a husband who treated her with cautious respect. Through the wall, she could hear Elias moving around his room, the quiet sounds of a man settling into evening routines. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove herself and find her place in this strange new life. But tonight, for the first time in months, she wasn't worried about money or medical bills or the approaching winter. Tonight, she was safe. A week into their marriage, Josie discovered the broken rocking chair in the barn loft, hidden beneath old horse blankets like a shameful secret. The chair was beautiful, had been once with carved wooden arms and a gentle curve that spoke of countless hours spent in quiet contemplation. Now one rocker was cracked, the seat sagged, and the whole structure tilted at a dangerous angle. She was exploring the barn, while Elias worked with the horses in the corral, familiarizing herself with the layout of her new world. The loft was full of stored equipment and forgotten treasures, including a trunk of women's clothes that made her heart clench with understanding. His first wife's belongings, carefully preserved and equally carefully hidden away. "You shouldn't be up there." Elias's voice from below made her jump. She looked down to find him standing at the bottom of the ladder, his expression unreadable. "I'm sorry. I was just... Come down before you fall and break your neck." His tone was sharp, sharper than he'd used with her before, and Josie felt heat rise in her cheeks. She climbed down carefully, acutely aware of his eyes on her as she descended. "I found a rocking chair," she said when her feet touched solid ground. "It's damaged, but it might be repairable." Something flickered across his face, pain perhaps, or anger. "Leave it alone." "But if it could be fixed." "I said leave it alone." The words came out harder than before, final as a closing door. Josie studied his face, seeing the tension in his jaw, the way his hands had clenched into fists. Whatever the story was behind that chair, it still had the power to hurt him. "All right," she said quietly. "I'm sorry I disturbed anything." Elias looked at her for a long moment, and she saw the exact instant when he realized he'd been harsh with her. His shoulders dropped, and he ran a hand through his dark hair. "No, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have snapped at you. It's just..." He paused, struggling with words. "That chair belonged to my first wife. She used it when she was expecting our baby." Understanding hit Josie like a physical blow. The chair wasn't just furniture, right? It was a memorial to dreams that had died, to hopes that had been buried in the small cemetery behind the church. "I understand," she said softly. "I won't go back up there. The whole loft is full of her things. I kept meaning to..." He shrugged helplessly. "Couldn't bring myself to get rid of them. Couldn't stand to look at them either." "How long has it been?" 7 years this spring." His voice was quiet, distant with memory. "Her name was Sarah. She was 19 when we married, sweet as summer honey and twice as precious. The pregnancy was hard on her, but she was so excited about the baby, used to sit in that chair for hours, talking to him, singing little songs. They'd known the baby was a boy, had probably chosen names and made plans for his future. The weight of Elias's loss settled on Josie's shoulders like a heavy cloak. She died in childbirth? Both of them. Sarah fought for 3 days, but she was too small, and the baby was too big. Dr. Patterson did everything he could, but... Elias's voice broke slightly, and he cleared his throat. "She made me promise to be happy again someday. Last thing she said to me." Josie felt tears prick her eyes. No wonder this man was so guarded, so careful with his emotions. He'd already given his heart completely once, and it had been shattered beyond repair. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I can't imagine losing someone you loved so much." "That's why this arrangement works," Elias said, his voice steadying. "No expectations, no promises we can't keep, just practical partnership." But even as he said it, Josie heard the loneliness underneath the practical words. 7 years was a long time to grieve alone, a long time to live in a house full of ghosts. "Would it help if I organized her things?" she asked carefully, "not to get rid of them, But to store them properly, some of those dresses are silk. They'll be ruined if they're not cared for. Elias considered this for a long moment. You wouldn't mind? Of course not. She was your wife, the mother of your child. Her memory deserves respect. Something shifted in his expression, surprise, perhaps, or gratitude. Thank you. That's kind of you. We're all carrying someone's memory, Elias. The least we can do is carry it with dignity. That afternoon, while Elias worked with the cattle, Josie climbed back into the loft with proper storage material, cedar blocks, lavender sachets, and clean cotton sheets. She worked slowly and carefully, treating each item with the reverence due to a woman who had been deeply loved. The clothes told a story of their own. Wedding dress of ivory silk, carefully preserved and yellowed only slightly with age. Everyday dresses in cheerful colors, many showing signs of having been let out to accommodate a growing belly. A baby blanket, half finished, the knitting needles still holding stitches that would never be completed. Josie found herself weeping as she worked, mourning for a woman she'd never met and a child who'd never drawn breath. The tragedy of it was overwhelming, young love cut short, dreams destroyed, a future that had died before it could begin. When she climbed down from the loft hours later, her dress was dusty and her heart was heavy. Elias was waiting in the barn, apparently having finished his work early. "How are you managing?" he asked, his voice gentle. "It's heartbreaking," Josie admitted. "She had such beautiful things. She must have been very excited about the baby." She was. Used to plan everything, what we'd teach him, how we'd expand the house when he got older, what kind of man she hoped he'd become. Elias's voice carried the weight of old pain. "She would have been a wonderful mother. She would have been lucky to have you as his father, too." Elias looked at her sharply, as if surprised by the compliment. "What makes you say that?" "The way you are with the animals. I've watched you with the horses, the way you gentle them instead of breaking them. That takes patience and kindness." Josie brushed dust from her skirt, suddenly embarrassed by her boldness. "A man who can be tender with animals would be tender with children. Sarah used to say the same thing." He was quiet for a moment, lost in memory. "She said I'd be the kind of father who'd teach his son to be strong, but never cruel." She was right. They stood in the gathering dusk, surrounded by the familiar sounds of the ranch settling into evening. Josie had expected this conversation to be awkward, painful for both of them. Instead, there was something healing in it, as if speaking Sarah's name aloud had released some of the pressure that had been building in Elias's chest for 7 years. "The chair," he said suddenly. "Could it really be repaired?" "I think so. The damage isn't as bad as it looks, mostly just wear and neglect. With some new wood and proper attention, it could be beautiful again." "Would you?" He paused, struggling with the words. "Would you like to have it in your room? If I fixed it, I mean." The offer took her breath away. He was willing to repair his dead wife's chair for her, to let her use something that had been sacred to his first marriage. It was a gesture of trust, so profound it made her dizzy. "Only if you're sure. I don't want to intrude on her memory." "You're not intruding. You're—" He searched for the right word. "You're honoring it. Sarah would have liked that. She would have liked you." "Thank you," Josie whispered, understanding that she'd just been given a gift more precious than gold. That night, she heard sounds from the barn long after full darkness had fallen. Rhythmic scraping of sandpaper, the careful tap of a hammer, the quiet concentration of a man working to repair something broken. When she finally drifted off to sleep, the sounds were still continuing, steady and determined, in the Montana night. The next morning, she woke to find the rocking chair sitting beside her bedroom window, its wood gleaming with fresh oil and its joints solid and true. A note lay on the seat in Elias's precise handwriting. "For kindness given and received." Josie sank into the chair and found it perfect, the right height, the right angle, the gentle motion that had once soothed a pregnant woman and her unborn child. Now it would comfort her, this stranger who had stumbled into Elias's life and somehow found herself keeper of his most precious memories. She rocked gently as the sun rose, thinking about the woman who had sat here before her, about the love that had filled this chair and the loss that had emptied it. Sarah Boone had been gone for 7 years, but her presence still filled this house, still shaped the man who had loved her. Josie would never replace her, didn't want to replace her, but perhaps she could add her own presence to these rooms, her own warmth to balance the chill of old grief. Perhaps practical partnership could grow into something deeper, something that honored the past while building toward a different kind of future. The chair rocked gently in the morning light, carrying her hopes and Sarah's memory in equal measure. Winter arrived early that year, blowing in on a November wind that rattled the windows and sent cattle huddling together for warmth. Josie had been married to Elias for 6 weeks, and they'd settled into a rhythm that was comfortable, if not quite natural. Careful politeness, shared meals, and conversations that skimmed the surface of deeper waters. It was during the first real blizzard that everything changed. Josie had spent the afternoon pressing wildflowers between the pages of her mother's old Bible, a hobby she'd taken up to preserve some beauty from the harsh landscape. The flowers were simple prairie roses, Indian paintbrush, black-eyed Susan's butt. She loved their delicate colors and the way they reminded her that even in this unforgiving country, lovely things could grow. The storm hit just as the sun was setting, wind howling down from the mountains with a fury that shook the house to its foundations. Elias came in from the evening chores with snow in his hair and ice forming on his mustache. "Bad one," he said, stamping his boots and hanging up his coat. "Could last 3 days." Josie looked out the window at the wall of white that had swallowed the landscape. "The cattle. They'll huddle in the drawers where there's shelter. We've moved them to the winter pastures already. They know how to survive." But she could see the worry in his eyes, the way he kept glancing toward the windows, as if he could see through the storm to check on his animals. This was a man who took responsibility seriously, who felt the weight of every life under his care. They ate dinner by lamplight, while the wind screamed around the house like a living thing. The flames flickered with each gust, and occasionally the whole structure would shudder, as if it might lift off its foundations. "House has weathered worse storms than this," Elias said, noticing her nervous glances at the ceiling. "My grandfather built it to last. It's just so loud. I've never heard wind like this. Mountain storms are different from valley weather. Sound carries differently up here, hits harder." As if to prove his point, a particularly vicious gust slammed into the house, making the dishes rattle on the table. The lamps flickered ominously, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the kitchen, they heard the crash of something falling. "I'd better check that," Elias said, rising from his chair. He returned a few minutes later with the news that a tree branch had broken one of the parlor windows, and snow was already drifting inside. They spent the next hour boarding up the opening with whatever materials they could find, working together to hammer boards into place while the storm raged just inches away. "That should hold until morning," Elias said as he surveyed their makeshift repair. "We'll have to replace the glass when the weather clears." But the storm wasn't finished with them. Around midnight, as they sat by the fire trying to stay warm, the lights went out completely. The wind had knocked down the power lines, leaving them in darkness except for the flickering firelight. "I'll get more wood," Elias said, but when he tried to open the front door, it wouldn't budge. Snow had drifted against it, trapping them inside. "The back door?" Josie suggested. That was blocked, too. They were effectively prisoners in their own house, with only the wood already inside to keep them warm until the storm passed. "How long will the fire last?" Josie asked, trying to keep the panic out of her voice. "Depends on how careful we are with it. Maybe 12 hours if we're smart about it." Elias looked around the room, taking inventory. "We'll need to stay close to the fireplace, conserve heat." They dragged the mattress from her bedroom into the main room, along with every blanket and quilt they could find. It felt strangely intimate, this shared sleeping arrangement, born of necessity, but there was no alternative. The temperature was dropping by the hour, and the fire was their only source of warmth. "I'm sorry," Elias said as they arranged the bedding. "This isn't what you signed up for when you married me." "Blizzards aren't anyone's fault," Josie replied, but she was thinking about more than the weather. 6 weeks of marriage, and this was the closest they'd been to each other physically and emotionally. The crisis was stripping away the careful politeness they'd maintained, revealing something more honest underneath. They lay down fully clothed under the pile of blankets, the fire crackling between them and the storm raging outside. The intimacy of it was overwhelming his scent, the sound of his breathing, the warmth radiating from his large frame. "Tell me about the flowers," he said quietly. "What flowers?" "The ones you've been pressing. I've seen you working with them in the afternoons." Josie was surprised he'd noticed. "Just wild flowers from around the ranch. I thought they were beautiful, and I wanted to preserve them. My mother used to do the same thing, had books full of pressed flowers from every place we lived." His voice was soft in the darkness. "She said it was her way of holding on to the good moments." "That's exactly it. Even when everything seems harsh and difficult, there's still beauty if you look for it." Sarah never understood that. She was always trying to plant gardens that wouldn't grow in this climate, fighting the land instead of working with it. He paused. "You see what's already here?" It was the most personal thing he'd ever said to her, and Josie felt something shift between them in the firelit darkness. They were talking around the edges of deeper truths, circling feelings neither of them was ready to name. "I pressed some prairie roses last week," she said. "The ones that grow wild by the creek. They're small, but the color is so intense. Show me tomorrow, if you'd like." They fell quiet after that, listening to the storm and the fire. Josie was acutely aware of Elias beside her, the way his breathing eventually deepened into sleep while she lay awake watching the flames dance on the hearth. She studied his face in the firelight, the strong features relaxed and somehow younger in sleep. This was her husband, this complicated man who carried his grief like armor and showed kindness in small, careful gestures. He'd married her for practical reasons, just as she'd married him. But lying here in the storm-wrapped darkness, she realized her feelings had grown beyond practicality. She was falling in love with him. The knowledge should have terrified her, but instead it brought a strange peace. Love wasn't part of their bargain, wasn't something either of them had planned or expected. But it was happening anyway, growing quietly in the spaces between their careful conversations and shared meals. When she finally drifted off to sleep, it was to the sound of his breathing and the storm outside, safe and warm beside the man who was becoming more than a husband of convenience. She woke to find snow still falling, but the wind much quieter. Elias was already up, feeding the fire and making coffee on the hearth. "Storm's breaking," he said when he saw her stirring. "Should be able to dig our way out by afternoon." "How are the animals?" "I can see some of the horses from the front window. They're huddled but alive. Cattle know how to weather storms like this, they'll be fine." They shared breakfast by the fire, and Josie found herself reluctant to return to normal routines. The forced intimacy of the storm had broken down barriers between them, created an honesty that she didn't want to lose. "Elias," she said as they finished eating, "last night, when we talked about the flowers, I meant it. I'd like to see them." "That's not what I was going to say." She gathered her courage. "I was going to say that I'm glad we were trapped together, glad we had to really talk to each other." He looked at her for a long moment, something unguarded in his expression. "So am I. Are we friends now? Real friends, I mean, not just polite strangers sharing a house." "I think we might be." "Good." Josie smiled, feeling lighter than she had in weeks. "Because I was getting tired of being so careful all the time." "Me too." When they finally dug their way out that afternoon, the world had been transformed. Snow covered everything in pristine white, broken only by the tracks of rabbits and the distant shapes of cattle moving through the draws. It was beautiful and harsh, and somehow perfect like everything else about this strange life she'd stumbled into. That evening, as they sat by the fire in their restored parlor, Josie showed Elias her pressed flowers. He examined each one carefully, asking questions about where she'd found them, what drew her to their particular beauty. "This one," he said, touching a delicate prairie rose. "Sarah would have loved this." It wasn't a comparison or a judgment, just an observation, shared between friends. And Josie realized that she no longer felt threatened by his first wife's memory. Sarah was part of Elias's story, part of what had made him the man sitting beside her now. There was room in his heart for both the woman he'd lost and the woman he was learning to know. The pressed flowers lay between them like promises small, beautiful things preserved against time and weather, holding their color long after the original blooms had faded. Like the feelings growing between them, fragile but real, worth protecting against whatever storms might come. 3 weeks after the blizzard, Josie sat at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and a pen that trembled in her hand. She'd been trying to write this letter for days, but the words never came out right. How do you tell a dead man that you found something you never expected to find? Dear Papa, she finally wrote, I hope you're at peace. I hope Mama is with you, and you're both watching over me in this strange new life I've chosen. She paused, staring out the window at the snow-covered landscape. Elias was in the barn, tending to a mare that was due to foal any day. She could see his tall figure moving between the stalls, patient and gentle with the expectant mother. I married him for practical reasons, just like you always taught me head over heart, security over sentiment. But Papa, something is happening that I didn't plan for. I think I'm falling in love with my husband. The words looked stark on the page, an admission she'd been afraid to make even to herself, but writing them down made them real, undeniable. He's not like the men in the romance novels Mama used to read. He doesn't speak of love or make grand gestures, but he fixes broken things without being asked. He rescued 3 orphaned calves last week and bottle-fed them in the kitchen until they were strong enough to rejoin the herd. He notices small things when I'm tired, when I need help reaching something on a high shelf, when I've been quiet too long. She thought about the morning he'd found her crying over a burnt breakfast, overwhelmed by the weight of trying to be the perfect wife to a man she barely knew. Instead of scolding her or dismissing her tears, he'd simply cleaned up the mess and made her sit down while he cooked eggs and bacon with the competent efficiency of a man who'd been caring for himself for years. Yesterday, I found him reading in the parlor after dinner, not ranch business or account books, but poetry. Papa, this hard, intimidating man was reading Walt Whitman by lamplight, and when he saw me watching, he wasn't embarrassed. He just asked if I'd like him to read aloud. She remembered sitting in Sarah's rocking chair, while Elias's deep voice filled the room with words about grass and stars and the beauty of ordinary things. His reading voice was different from his speaking voices, softer, more musical, as if the poetry unlocked something in him that daily conversation couldn't reach. I'm afraid, Papa, afraid that I'm falling in love with a man who can't love me back, not the way he loved his first wife. But I'm also afraid that I won't fall completely, that I'll hold back and miss something wonderful because I'm too scared to risk my heart. The kitchen door opened, and Elias came in with snow on his boots and cold reddening his cheeks. He hung up his coat and hat, then crossed to the stove, where coffee was still warm from breakfast. Mare's doing well, he said. Should drop that foal any day now. First birth of the season? Should be. Always makes me nervous, but she's strong and healthy. Good bloodlines. Josie watched him pour coffee, noting the way his large hands handled the delicate cup with care. Everything about Elias was careful, controlled, as if he'd learned to measure every gesture and word. Elias, she said impulsively, what did you want to be when you were young? Before you inherited the ranch, I mean. He looked surprised by the question. Why do you ask? I was just wondering. You're so good at this life, it's hard to imagine you ever wanting anything else. He sat down across from her, cradling his coffee cup in both hands. I wanted to be a teacher. Really? Loved books, loved learning. Thought I'd like to help children discover the same joy in reading that I'd found. He smiled ruefully. My father had other plans. Said the ranch needed a man who understood the land, not someone with his head in the clouds. Do you regret it? Sometimes. When I see how the school in town struggles to keep good teachers, or when I meet a child who's hungry to learn but has no one to guide them. He shrugged. But this is good work too. Honest work that feeds people and builds something lasting. You could still teach, not in a formal school, but Josie gestured toward the window, where several of the ranch hands were working. Some of those men can barely read their own names. You could help them? Maybe. but she could see the idea taking root in his mind, adding another layer to her understanding of this complex man. "What about you?" he asked. "What did you dream of before? Before Papa got sick?" Josie finished the thought he'd been too tactful to complete. "I wanted to write. Stories, maybe a novel someday. I used to fill notebooks with tales about brave women and distant places." "Do you still write?" "Not stories. Just letters like this one." She gestured toward the unfinished letter on the table. "Who are you writing to?" Josie felt heat rise in her cheeks. "My father. I know it sounds foolish, but sometimes I need to tell him things, and writing letters helps me think through my feelings." Instead of mocking her, Elias nodded seriously. "I used to talk to Sarah's grave. Still do, sometimes, when I'm wrestling with difficult decisions." "What do you tell her?" "About the ranch, mostly. Changes I'm making, problems I'm facing. Sometimes about—" He paused, looking directly at Josie. "Sometimes about how different life is now." The words hung between them, weighted with meaning neither was quite ready to explore. Josie felt her pulse quicken, sensing they were approaching dangerous territory, the acknowledgement of feelings that could complicate their careful arrangement. "Different? How?" she asked softly. "Warmer, less lonely, like the house is alive again instead of just a place where I sleep." Her breath caught. It was the closest thing to a declaration of feeling he'd ever made, and it sent warmth spreading through her chest like whiskey on a cold night. "I feel the same way," she admitted, "like I'm becoming myself again, instead of just surviving from one day to the next." They looked at each other across the kitchen table, both recognizing that they were standing at the edge of something that would change everything. The practical arrangement they'd made was evolving into something neither had planned for, something that could be beautiful or devastating, depending on how carefully they navigated it. "Josie," Elias said quietly, "our year together, what happens when it's up?" "I don't know." The answer was honest, but incomplete. What she didn't say was that she no longer wanted the year to end, that the thought of leaving this house and this man made her chest tight with panic. "Neither do I." Before either could say more, they heard shouting from the barnon of the ranch hands calling for help. Elias was on his feet instantly, grabbing his coat and hat. "The mayor," he said, "something's wrong." Josie watched him stride toward the barn, then looked down at her unfinished letter. The conversation they'd been having would have to wait, but the words already spoken had changed something between them. They were no longer just practical partners enduring a business arrangement. They were two people falling in love, whether they were ready for it or not. She picked up her pen and added one final line to the letter. "Pray for me, Papa. I think I'm about to risk everything on the chance that love might be worth more than security." Then she folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her mother's Bible, pressed between the pages like one of her wildflowers, a fragile, beautiful thing preserved against an uncertain future. The official-looking document arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, carried by a courier who rode hard from town and insisted on waiting for a response. Josie was hanging laundry when she saw the man approach, and something about his urgency made her stomach clench with foreboding. Elias read the papers in the kitchen while she poured coffee for their unexpected guest, his face growing darker with each line. When he finished, he set the documents down with deliberate calm, but his hands were trembling with suppressed rage. "What is it?" Josie asked. "Legal challenge to our marriage." His voice was steady, but she could hear the fury underneath. "Someone's claiming it's fraudulent." The courier, a thin man with nervous eyes, cleared his throat. "Mr. Weatherby instructed me to wait for your response, sir. He said you'd want to address the matter quickly." Marcus Weatherby. Josie had heard the name whispered in Tona, ruthless businessman who'd been buying up struggling ranches throughout the territory, always at prices that barely covered outstanding debts. She'd never seen him, but his reputation preceded him like the smell of sulfur. "What's his claim?" Elias asked, his tone dangerously quiet. "Says here that your marriage was entered into solely for the purpose of meeting your father's will requirements, making it a sham marriage under territorial law." The courier shifted uncomfortably. "He's got documentation that suggests it ain't a real marriage." Josie felt the blood drain from her face. What kind of documentation? Witness statements saying you two barely knew each other before the wedding. Records showing Mrs. Boone was facing financial ruin right before the ceremony. Bank statements showing Mr. Boone paid off her father's debts immediately after the marriage. The courier looked apologetic. Makes it look like a business transaction rather than a true union. Elias stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. Get out. Sir, I need an answer for Mr. Weatherby. Tell Weatherby he can go to hell, and tell him if he sets foot on my land, I'll treat him like any other trespasser. The courier left quickly, clearly relieved to escape the tension crackling in the kitchen. Josie stared at the papers Elias had left on the table, her mind reeling from the implications. Can he do this? Can he actually challenge our marriage? He can try. Elias was pacing now, his long strides eating up the small kitchen. The question is whether he can prove it. But we are legally married. We signed the papers, had a proper ceremony. That's not what he's challenging. He's claiming our marriage violates territorial laws against marriages of convenience. If he can prove we entered into it solely for financial or legal purposes, without intent to create a genuine marital relationship. Elias stopped pacing and looked at her directly. A judge could annul it. The words hit Josie like a physical blow, their marriage annulled, as if it had never existed. Elias would lose his land, and she would be right back where she'd started, homeless, penniless, with nowhere to turn. Why would Weatherby care about our marriage? Because if he can break it, he can claim the land through the family trust. My father's will specified that if I died unmarried, or if my marriage was found invalid, the property would go to the nearest male relative. Elias's jaw tightened. My cousin Robert sold his interest to Weatherby 3 years ago. Probably been planning this challenge ever since. Josie sank into her chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the threat. Everything they'd built together, fragile as it was, could be destroyed by a man who saw their relationship as nothing more than a legal technicality to exploit. What evidence does he have? Elias picked up the papers again, scanning them with a lawyer's eye. Statements from people in town who observed our courtship or lack thereof. Financial records showing the timing of debt payments. Even testimony from Mrs. Henderson about our wedding dinner, how we barely spoke to each other. All of which is true, Josie said quietly. Yes. They sat in silence, the weight of their situation settling between them like a stone. Everything Weatherby's investigators had discovered was accurate. They had married for practical reasons, barely knowing each other, with clear financial incentives on both sides. There's something else, Elias said, his voice carefully controlled. The challenge includes a timeline. If we can't prove our marriage is genuine within 60 days, it will be automatically annulled. 60 days. Josie felt panic rising in her throat. How do we prove a marriage is genuine? Shared assets, joint decisions, evidence of physical and emotional intimacy. His cheeks reddened slightly at the last item. Things that demonstrate we're actually living as husband and wife, not just sharing a house for convenience. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Just as they'd begun to develop real feelings for each other, they were being forced to prove those feelings existed, and to do it convincingly enough to satisfy a territorial judge. Elias, Josie said slowly, what if we can't prove it? Then I lose the ranch, and you, he stopped, unable to finish the thought. I'll survive. I did before I met you, and I will again. No. The word came out fierce, final. I won't let that happen. This is my fight, my responsibility. It's our fight now. He's challenging our marriage, not just yours. Before Elias could respond, they heard the sound of another horse approaching. Through the window, Josie saw a familiar figure dismounting at their gate, a tall, well-dressed man, with sandy hair and confident bearing. Oh no, she breathed. Who is that? Thomas Whitmore, from back east. Her voice came out small and strained. We had an understanding before Papa got sick. Elias's expression darkened further. Your former suitor. I wrote to him when Papa died, to explain why I couldn't, why our engagement was no longer possible. I never expected him to come west. But Thomas was already striding toward the house, his expensive clothes and city bearing, making him look foreign against the rough Montana landscape. He knocked firmly on the door, and Elias answered it with barely controlled hostility. "I'm looking for Miss Josie Mallory," Thomas said, his cultured Eastern accent making Elias's Western drawl seem crude by comparison. "Mrs. Boone," Elias corrected coldly. "My wife." Thomas's face went through a series of expression: surprise, dismay, and something that might have been calculation. "Josie, is this true?" She appeared beside Elias, acutely aware of how she must look, flower on her apron, hair escaping from its pins, hands rough from ranch work. Thomas, by contrast, looked like he'd stepped out of a magazine, perfectly groomed, expensively dressed, everything she'd once thought she wanted in a husband. "Hello, Thomas. Yes, it's true. Elias and I were married in November. But your letter, you said you needed time to settle your father's affairs. I came to help, to take you back to Boston where you belong." The words stung, carrying the implicit message that she didn't belong here, in this wild country with this rough man. And looking at Thomas now, remembering his refined manners, his financial stability, the security he represented, Josie felt a moment of devastating doubt. "I appreciate you coming all this way," she said carefully, "but as you can see, I've already found a solution to my circumstances." "Have you?" Thomas's eyes moved between her and Elias, clearly noting the tension, the way they stood near each other but not touching, the formal politeness that marked their interaction. "Forgive me, but this seems rather sudden. When I knew you, you spoke of wanting love in marriage, not just convenience." It was exactly the wrong thing to say. Elias's face went stone cold, and Josie felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. Thomas had no way of knowing about Weatherby's challenge, but his words echoed the very accusations they were struggling to disprove. "Times change," she said stiffly. "People adapt to circumstances." "Indeed they do," Thomas smiled, but there was something predatory in it. "Perhaps we could speak privately. I have news from home, and I'd like to discuss certain opportunities that might interest you. Anything you have to say to my wife, you can say in front of me," Elias growled. "Actually," Thomas said, his smile widening, "I believe this concerns both of you. I've been in town since yesterday, and I've heard some interesting stories about your marriage. It seems there are questions about its legitimacy." Josie's blood turned to ice. "What do you mean?" "A man named Weatherby approached me at the hotel. Seems he's conducting an investigation into marriages of convenience in the territory. He was very interested to learn that I'd been engaged to you, that I'd come west specifically to bring you home." The trap was closing around them, and Josie could see the calculation in Thomas's eyes. He'd aligned himself with Weatherby, perhaps seeing an opportunity to reclaim the woman he'd traveled so far to find. "He made me an interesting proposition," Thomas continued. "If I could convince you to leave with me voluntarily, of course it would certainly support his case that your current marriage was never intended to be permanent." "Get off my land," Elias said, his voice deadly quiet. "I'm not on your land yet, friend. I'm standing on a public road, having a conversation with a lady I've known since childhood." Thomas's tone remained pleasant, but his eyes were hard. "Josie, you don't have to stay trapped in a loveless marriage. I can offer you everything you once dreamed of: a real home, financial security, a position in society." "She has all of that here," Elias said. "Does she? Or does she have a business arrangement that could be dissolved at any moment?" Thomas looked directly at Josie. "Come with me, and you'll never have to worry about money or security again. Stay here, and you're gambling everything on a marriage that a judge is likely to declare invalid anyway." The offer hung in the air between them like smoke from a distant fire. Josie looked at Thomas, handsome, successful, offering her a life of comfort and respectability, then at Elias, whose grey eyes held a pain that cut straight through her heart. "I need time to think," she said finally. "Of course, I'll be at the hotel for a few days, settling some business matters with Mr. Weatherby." When you're ready to discuss the future sensibly, you know where to find me." Thomas tipped his hat to both of them. "Good day, Mrs. Boone. I hope you make the right choice." After he left, Josie and Elias stood in their kitchen, the forged marriage certificate from Weatherby, still lying on the table between them like an accusation. The document was sophisticated, designed to look like an official challenge, but actually created to sow doubt and fear. "You're considering it," Elias said quietly. "I'm considering what's best for both of us. Running away with your former fiancé is what's best." "Maybe." The word came out sharper than she'd intended. "At least with Thomas, I know what I'm getting. Security, stability, a husband who actually wants a wife instead of just a legal convenience." Elias flinched as if she'd struck him. "Is that what you think this is? Still?" Josie looked at him, really looked, and saw the hurt in his eyes, the way her words had wounded him. But the fear was stronger than her compassion, the terror of losing everything again, overwhelming her ability to think clearly. "I don't know what this is anymore," she admitted, "and maybe that's the problem." That night, Josie stood up abruptly, the medal box sliding from her lap to the floor. The bronze star caught the moonlight as it fell, spinning like a fallen piece of heaven. "That's the most arrogant thing you've ever said to me." Elias looked startled by her vehemence. "Josie, no, listen to me. For months, I've watched you carry guilt that doesn't belong to you, seen you punish yourself for tragedies you couldn't prevent. And now you want to make my choices for me too? I'm trying to protect you. From what? From a man who fixes broken chairs without being asked? From someone who reads poetry by lamplight and teaches ranch hands to write their names? From a husband who's shown me more kindness in 6 months than some people see in a lifetime? From a man who destroys everything he touches?" The pain in his voice almost broke her resolve, but Josie pushed forward, driven by a fierce need to make him see himself as she saw him. "You want to know what I see when I look at you? I see a man who risked his life to save strangers, who came home from war and built something good and lasting with his hands. I see someone who loved his first wife so completely that he's been afraid to love again, not because he doesn't have room in his heart, but because he has too much." Tears were streaming down her face now, but she didn't care. "I see my husband, Elias. Not a convenience, not a business arrangement, but the man I choose to stand beside, no matter what Marcus Weatherby or Thomas Whitmore or anyone else tries to take from us." Elias stared at her, his grey eyes wide with something that might have been hope. "You're choosing me? I chose you the night of the blizzard, when we talked about flowers, and I realized I wanted to know everything about the man behind all that careful distance. I chose you when you repaired Sarah's chair, and trusted me with her memory. I choose you now, when everything's falling apart and the smart thing would be to run. Even if we lose the ranch, even if Weatherby wins and we have nothing, we'll have each other. That's not nothing, Elias. That's everything." He stood slowly, as if afraid sudden movement might shatter the moment. When he reached for her, his hands were trembling. "I love you," he said, the words rough with emotion. "I've been trying not to, but I love you so much it terrifies me." "I love you too." The admission felt like stepping off a cliff into open air. "I love your gentleness with animals, your quiet strength, the way you see beauty in small things. I love that you carry other people's pain because you think it's your responsibility. I even love your stubborn determination to protect everyone but yourself." They came together in the moonlit room, their first real kiss tasting of tears and desperate honesty. It was nothing like the polite peck they'd shared at their wedding. This was hunger and hope and the promise of something worth fighting for. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard, foreheads pressed together in the intimate darkness. "What do we do now?" Josie whispered. "We fight. Together." Elias's voice was steady, no longer carrying the weight of solitary burden. "Weatherby wants to prove our marriage is a sham. We show him what real love looks like. And Thomas? You tell him you've already found everything you're looking for." They spent the rest of the night planning, sitting close together at the kitchen table, sharing ideas and strategies like the true partners they'd finally admitted to being. They would gather evidence of their genuine relationship, witness statements from the ranch hands who'd observed their growing closeness, documentation of shared decisions and joint purchases, anything that proved their marriage had evolved beyond mere convenience. More importantly, they would present themselves as they truly were, two people who'd found love in unexpected circumstances, who'd built something real from the foundation of mutual need. "We'll need allies," Elias said as dawn began to lighten the eastern sky. "People who can testify to the genuineness of our relationship. Dr. Patterson delivered that foal last month. He saw how we worked together, how you trusted me to assist. Mrs. Henderson noticed how we've changed since the wedding. She mentioned it last time we were in town, said we seemed more comfortable with each other." They were building a case for their own love, gathering evidence of feelings they'd been too afraid to acknowledge. It felt strange and wonderful and terrifying all at once. "There's something else," Elias said as they finished their coffee, "something Weatherby might not expect." "What?" "We could renew our vows. Not quietly, but publicly, with the whole town watching. Let everyone see that we're choosing each other freely, not because of legal requirements or financial necessity." The idea sent a thrill through Josie's chest. A real wedding, with real vows spoken from the heart, instead of careful legal formalities. A celebration of the love they'd discovered instead of the arrangement they'd made. "Would you want that?" she asked. "More than anything. I want to marry you again, Josie, this time for all the right reasons." Outside, the sun was rising over the Montana grassland, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. A new day was beginning, full of challenges they would face together instead of separately. "Then let's do it," Josie said, reaching for his hand. "Let's show Marcus Weatherby and Thomas Whitmore and anyone else who doubts us exactly what we're made of." Elias lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Mrs. Boone, I think we're about to scandalize the entire territory." "Good," she said, laughing despite the tears still drying on her cheeks. "It's about time this marriage became the kind worth gossiping about." They had 60 days to prove their love was real. As they sat together in the growing light, hands clasped and hearts finally open, Josie knew they would need every one of them. Lay awake in Sarah's rocking chair, staring out at the star-filled Montana sky. The house was quiet except for the occasional creak of settling wood and the distant sound of cattle lowing in the pastures. Somewhere down the hall, Elias was probably lying awake too, wrestling with the same impossible choices that kept sleep at bay. She'd been searching through his desk earlier, looking for documents that might help their case, when she'd found it a small wooden box tucked in the back of a drawer, wrapped in oiled cloth. Inside, nestled in blue velvet, was a medal she didn't recognize, bronze and ribbon, tarnished with age but carefully preserved. Congressional Medal of Honor. The inscription read, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty." The name engraved below was Elias Thomas Boone, and the date was from the Indian Wars, 15 years past. Her husband was a war hero. Not just a soldier, but a man who had risked everything to save others, who had faced death with such courage that his country had honored him with its highest military decoration. And he'd never said a word about it, had let people whisper their dark rumors about his past, while keeping his true history locked away. The discovery changed everything she thought she knew about the man she'd married. Elias wasn't running from a violent past, was carrying the weight of honor he felt he no longer deserved. The reservation in his manner, the way he held himself apart from others, it all made sense now. He'd seen combat, had probably lost men under his command, had come home to a country that was already forgetting the sacrifices made in its name. And when Sarah died, when his chance at a normal life was torn away, he'd retreated into the solitude that had become his armor against further loss. "You're up late." His voice from the doorway made her jump. Elias stood silhouetted against the hallway light, wearing just his trousers and an undershirt, his dark hair mussed from restless sleep. "I couldn't sleep," she said, "too much to think about." He came into the room, moving with the careful quiet of a man who'd learned to walk silently through dangerous places. When he saw the medal box in her lap, he stopped abruptly. "You went through my desk." I was looking for legal documents, anything that might help our case. Josie held up the medal, its bronze surface catching the moonlight. You never told me you were a war hero. I'm not. This says otherwise. Elias sat down heavily in the chair across from her, suddenly looking older than his 34 years. That medal belongs to the men who died under my command. I just happened to be the one who survived to receive it. What happened? For a long moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, slowly, the story came out, halting at first, then with the steady rhythm of a man who'd been carrying the weight of memory alone for too long. He'd been a lieutenant in the cavalry, stationed at Fort Robinson during the final campaigns against the Northern Cheyenne. When a band of warriors had broken from the reservation and begun raiding settlements, Elias's unit had been sent to track them down. They'd found the Indians holed up in a canyon, wounded and desperate, with women and children among them. The colonel wanted to charge straight in, kill them all and be done with it. But I could see there were families down there, people who were just trying to get home. His voice was distant with memory. I convinced him to let me try to negotiate a surrender. The negotiation had failed, fighting had broken out, and Elias had found himself trapped in the canyon with a handful of his men, surrounded by warriors who had nothing left to lose. When his sergeant was wounded, when the situation became hopeless, Elias had made a choice that haunted him still. I went out under a white flag, offered myself in exchange for safe passage for my men and the Indian families. He looked directly at Josie, his grey eyes holding shadows she was only beginning to understand. The chief was a good man, caught between honor and survival. We worked out terms my life for the safety of everyone else. But you survived. The colonel ignored our agreement. When he saw me talking to the chief, he ordered a charge. Thought I was being held prisoner, that he was rescuing me. Elias's hands clenched and unclenched in his lap. The slaughter that followed, women, children, old men who couldn't fight it, was my fault. If I hadn't tried to negotiate, if I'd just followed orders, those people would have died anyway, Josie said softly. At least you tried to save them. I saved no one. The men who died in that canyon, they died because I was too proud to accept that some situations can't be fixed with words and good intentions. Josie began to understand the depth of his self-imposed isolation. Elias blamed himself for a massacre that would have happened regardless, carried guilt for deaths that weren't his responsibility. The medal wasn't a symbol of honor to him, it was a reminder of failure, of the price of caring too much. Is that why you came home? Why you never went back to the army? I came home because I couldn't look at another uniform without seeing blood on it. Bought out my commission and swore I'd never put anyone else at risk through my decisions. He reached for the medal, turning it over in his large hands. Sarah was the only good thing that came out of those years. She made me believe I could be something other than a soldier carrying dead men's guilt. And when she died, I knew I was cursed, that anyone who got close to me would pay the price for my mistakes. He looked up at her, his expression raw with pain. That's why this arrangement made sense. No expectations, no one else to lose. The admission hung between them like a bridge across dark water. Josie finally understood why Elias had been so careful with her, so determined to keep their relationship practical rather than emotional. He wasn't protecting himself from heartbreak, he was protecting her from what he believed was his own destructive influence. You're not cursed, she said firmly. You're a good man who's been carrying blame that doesn't belong to you. Am I? Then why is everything falling apart again? Why is Weatherby able to threaten our marriage? Why is your former fiancé here offering you the life you deserve? Because bad things happen sometimes, and they're not always someone's fault. Elias shook his head, the gesture weary and defeated. Maybe you should go with Thomas. Maybe that's the only way to keep you safe from whatever follows me. The words hit Josie like cold water, shocking her into clarity. Here was this remarkable man, this hero, who saw himself as a curse, trying to send her away because he thought it was best for her. The selflessness of it, the terrible loneliness it represented, broke her heart completely. Is that what you want? She asked. For me to leave? What I want doesn't matter. What's best for you matters. And you think you know what's best for me better than I do? I know I'm not it. The courthouse in Helena was packed tighter than Sunday service, every seat filled with curious spectators drawn by the scandalous story of the Boones' challenged marriage. Word had spread throughout the territory like wildfire, marriage of convenience, a contested will, a wealthy businessman trying to steal a ranch through legal manipulation. Josie sat at the defendant's table beside Elias, wearing her best dress and the simple gold wedding band that had become as essential as breathing. The past 2 weeks had been a whirlwind of preparation, gathering witnesses and evidence, consulting with lawyers who spoke in languages of precedent and territorial statute. Marcus Weatherby sat across the aisle with his attorney, a thin man from back east who carried himself with the arrogant confidence of someone accustomed to winning. Weatherby himself was younger than Josie had expected, perhaps 40, with the kind of smooth good looks that masked a calculating mind. When their eyes met, he smiled not pleasantly, but with the satisfaction of a predator who'd cornered his prey. Thomas sat in the gallery behind Weatherby's table, his presence a constant reminder of the choice Josie had rejected. He'd tried to approach her that morning outside the courthouse, offering one last chance to abandon this doomed farce and return with him to Boston. She'd declined so firmly that even his persistent charm had finally accepted defeat. Judge Morrison was a stern man in his 60s, weathered by decades of frontier justice and known for his impatience with legal theatrics. He studied the papers before him with the careful attention of someone who understood that his decision would affect far more than just the 2 people at the defendant's table. This court is asked to determine whether the marriage of Elias and Josephine Boone constitutes a valid union under territorial law, he began, his voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom. The plaintiff contends that said marriage was entered into solely for the purpose of meeting inheritance requirements, making it a fraudulent arrangement lacking the essential elements of genuine matrimony. Weatherby's attorney rose first, a ferret-faced man named Hutchins, who spoke in clipped Eastern vowels that made every word sound like an accusation. Your Honor, the evidence is overwhelming. Mrs. Boone was facing financial ruin when she approached my client's Mr. Boone's land-seeking employment. Within days of being refused work, she had entered into a marriage contract with a man she barely knew. The timing is suspicious, the circumstances are questionable, and the entire arrangement reeks of legal manipulation. He presented his case with theatrical precision, calling witnesses who testified to the speed of the courtship, the financial benefits that accrued to both parties, the formal distance that had initially characterized their relationship. The banker spoke of debts paid immediately after the wedding. Mrs. Patterson described their wedding dinner as polite but cold. Even the hotel clerk testified that Thomas Whitmore had registered specifically to rescue Miss Mallory from an unfortunate situation. Each piece of evidence was damaging, painting a picture of 2 desperate people who had used marriage as a tool rather than a sacrament. Josie felt the weight of every testimony, the way the courtroom's mood shifted with each revelation of their arrangement's practical origins. When Hutchins called Thomas to the stand, Josie's heart sank further. Mr. Whitmore, please tell the court about your relationship with the defendant. Thomas settled himself in the witness chair with easy confidence, his expensive suit and cultivated manner making him appear more credible than the rough frontiersman who made up most of the gallery. Josie, Mrs. Boone and I were engaged to be married, he said clearly. I had come west specifically to bring her back to Boston after her father's death. We had discussed our future together, our plans for a life of comfort and respectability. And what was her response when you offered to honor that engagement? She seemed torn, conflicted. It was clear to me that her current marriage was one of desperation rather than affection. She spoke of duty and obligation, but never once mentioned love. The words hit like physical blows, each one true enough to be damaging. Josie had been conflicted when Thomas arrived, had spoken of duty rather than love. The fact that her feelings had changed, that she'd discovered something profound with Elias, seemed irrelevant in the face of such testimony. In your opinion, Mr. Whitmore, what was Mrs. Boone's primary motivation for entering into marriage with the defendant? Survival, Thomas said simply. She needed shelter and security, and Mr. Boone needed a wife to satisfy his inheritance requirements. It was a business transaction dressed up as matrimony. When their own attorney, a local man named Bradley, who specialized in land disputes, rose to cross-examine, Josie held her breath. Mr. Whitmore, when exactly did you last speak with Mrs. Boone before coming west? Approximately 8 months ago, when I received her letter about her father's death. 8 months. And you felt qualified to assess her current emotional state based on a single conversation after such a long separation. I've known Josie since childhood. I understand her character, her needs. Do you? Then perhaps you can explain why she chose to remain with her husband rather than accept your offer of rescue. Thomas's confidence flickered slightly. She was confused, frightened by legal proceedings. People make poor decisions under stress. Or perhaps she was making the decision that reflected her true feelings, regardless of how the marriage began. It was a small victory, but Josie could see it wasn't enough. The damage had been done, the seeds of doubt planted in Judge Morrison's mind. When the court recessed for lunch, she felt the weight of certain defeat settling on her shoulders. "They're going to win," she whispered to Elias as they walked to a nearby restaurant. "Maybe, but we haven't presented our case yet." "What case? Everything they said was true. We did marry for practical reasons. We barely knew each other. I was facing financial ruin." Elias stopped walking and turned to face her on the busy street. "All of that is true, but it's not the whole truth." "What do you mean?" "The whole truth is what happened after the wedding. How we grew to know each other, how our feelings changed, how we chose to build something real from what started as necessity." His grey eyes were steady, unafraid. "Love doesn't always begin with violins and poetry, Josie. Sometimes it begins with two people deciding to be kind to each other and growing from there." That afternoon, Bradley began their defense by calling Dr. Patterson to the stand. The elderly physician spoke with quiet authority about the night he'd been called to assist with a difficult birth at the Boone ranch. "I arrived to find Mrs. Boone already assisting her husband with the mare," he testified. "She was calm, competent, following his instructions without question. But more than that, I observed the way they communicated wordless understanding, complete trust in each other's abilities. It was the kind of partnership you see in couples who've worked together for years." "This was how long after their wedding, Doctor?" "Perhaps 4 months. Still relatively early in their marriage, but the intimacy of their collaboration was unmistakable." Mrs. Henderson testified about changes she'd observed in their behavior during subsequent visits to town, the way Elias now helped Josie from wagons without being asked, how she checked with him before making purchases, small gestures that spoke of consideration and growing affection. "They seemed to fit together better each time I saw them," she said simply, "like two people learning to be comfortable in their own skin." But the most powerful testimony came from an unexpected source. Jake Morrison, one of Elias's longest-serving ranch hands, took the stand with obvious nervousness, but spoke with the blunt honesty of a man unaccustomed to lying. "Mr. Boone, he was different after the wedding," Jake said in response to Bradley's questions. "Not right away, but gradual-like. Started humming while he worked, which he ain't done since his first wife died. Started caring about things that wasn't just ranch business." "Can you give the court an example?" "Well, there was the time Mrs. Boone mentioned. She missed having flowers around the house. Next day, Mr. Boone spent 2 hours building her a flower box for the kitchen window. Then he rode 15 miles to find seeds that would grow in our climate." Jake looked directly at the judge. "A man don't do that kind of thing for a business arrangement, Your Honor. He does it for a woman he's falling in love with." The testimony continued through the afternoon, painting a picture of a relationship that had evolved from practical necessity into genuine partnership. But Josie could see the skepticism in Judge Morrison's face, the way Weatherby smiled with increasing confidence as the day wore on. When court adjourned for the day, she knew they were losing. Tomorrow would bring closing arguments and a decision that would determine not just their legal status, but the future they'd built together one careful day at a time. As they walked to their hotel that evening, Elias reached for her hand. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he said quietly, "I want you to know that these months with you have been the happiest of my life. Not because of the ranch or the inheritance, but because I finally found someone worth sharing it all with. Even if we lose everything, we'll still have each other. That's not nothing, remember?" Josie squeezed his hand, drawing strength from his steady presence. Tomorrow, they would discover whether love could triumph over suspicion, whether the truth of their feelings could overcome the circumstances of their beginning. But tonight, they had each other, and whatever came next, they would face it together. The second day of testimony began with a surprise that sent ripples of whispered conversation through the packed courtroom. Bradley rose from the defendant's table, holding a document that Josie didn't recognize, his expression more confident than it had been the day before. "Your Honor, the defense would like to present new evidence that has come to light regarding the plaintiff's claims." Judge Morrison frowned. "Mr. Bradley, you should have submitted any new evidence during the discovery period. This evidence was only obtained yesterday evening, Your Honor, and it directly bears on the plaintiff's standing to bring this challenge." Bradley approached the bench, offering the papers to the judge. "We've discovered that Mr. Weatherby's legal right to contest this marriage may itself be fraudulent." The courtroom erupted in murmurs as Weatherby's attorney jumped to his feet. "Objection. This is clearly a desperate attempt to—" "I'll allow it," Judge Morrison said, studying the documents. "But it had better be relevant, Mr. Bradley." "Thank you, Your Honor. I'd like to call Samuel Garrett to the stand." An elderly man in a worn but clean suit made his way to the witness chair. Josie recognized him as one of the clerks from the Territorial Records Office, a man who'd spent decades maintaining the complex web of land grants, deeds, and family trusts that governed property ownership in Montana. "Mr. Garrett, please state your occupation for the court." "Senior Records Clerk, Territorial Land Office, been maintaining property records for 37 years. And in the course of your duties, have you had occasion to examine the Boone family trust documents?" "Yes, sir, yesterday evening, at the request of Mr. Boone's attorney." Bradley moved closer to the witness stand, his voice carrying clearly through the suddenly attentive courtroom. "What did you discover about the transfer of Robert Boone's interest in the family trust to Marcus Weatherby?" Garrett consulted a ledger he'd brought with him. "The transfer document dated 3 years ago appears to be genuine. However, there's a problem with Mr. Robert Boone's authority to make such a transfer." "What kind of problem?" "Robert Boone died 4 years ago in Denver. Consumption, according to the death certificate. The transfer document is dated a full year after his death." The courtroom exploded. Weatherby's face went pale, while his attorney frantically shuffled through papers, clearly caught off guard by this revelation. Judge Morrison gavelled for order, but it took several minutes for the noise to subside. "Are you saying the transfer was forged?" Bradley asked, when quiet was restored. "Can't speak to forgery, that's not my area. But I can say that dead men don't sign legal documents, and the signature on that transfer was supposedly made by a man who'd been in his grave for 12 months. Weatherby was on his feet now, whispering urgently with his attorney. Hutchins looked like a man who'd suddenly realized he was standing in quicksand. "Your Honor," Hutchins said desperately, "even if there are irregularities with the transfer document, it doesn't change the fundamental question before this court, whether the Boone marriage is genuine." "Actually, it does," Judge Morrison replied, his voice hard as granite. "If Mr. Weatherby has no legal standing to challenge the inheritance provisions, then this entire proceeding is without merit. But, Your Honor—" "However," the judge continued, raising a hand to silence the attorney, "since we've heard testimony regarding the nature of the marriage itself, I'm inclined to complete the proceedings and rule on both matters." Bradley nodded respectfully. "The defense appreciates the court's thoroughness, Your Honor. In that spirit, we'd like to call one final witness." "Proceed." The defense calls Mrs. Josephine Boone. Josie's heart hammered as she made her way to the witness stand. She'd testified in her own defense before, during the legal proceedings surrounding her father's debts, but never with so much at stake. The packed courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath as she was sworn in. Bradley approached with the gentle manner of a family friend, his voice soft and encouraging. "Mrs. Boone, please tell the court how your marriage to Elias Boone began." "It began as a practical arrangement," Josie said clearly, her voice carrying to the back of the room. "I needed security and shelter. He needed a wife to meet the terms of his father's will. We were both desperate, and we made a bargain that benefited us both." A murmur ran through the gallery. She was confirming everything Weatherby's side had claimed. But Bradley merely nodded, unsurprised. "And is that how you would characterize your marriage today?" "No." The word came out strong and sure. "Today I would characterize it as the greatest blessing of my life." "What changed?" Josie looked out over the courtroom, her eyes finding Elias's steady gaze. Drawing strength from his presence, she began to speak from her heart. "We did. Day by day, conversation by conversation, small kindness by small kindness, we changed. I learned that my husband is a man who reads poetry by lamplight, who rescues orphaned animals, who spent hours carving a cradle for babies we might never have because he believes in hope more than fear." She could see some of the spectators leaning forward, caught by the quiet passion in her voice. "I learned that he carries guilt for tragedies that weren't his fault, that he spent years punishing himself for loving too deeply and losing too much. I learned that beneath his quiet exterior beats the heart of a man capable of profound tenderness." "And what did he learn about you?" "That I'm stronger than I look, that I can handle ranch life, that I can be a partner instead of just a dependent, that I see beauty in pressed flowers and damaged rocking chairs and men who think they're cursed." Tears were flowing down her cheeks now, but her voice remained steady. He learned that love doesn't always announce itself with trumpets and roses. Sometimes it grows quietly, like wildflowers in harsh soil, until one day you realize it's the most beautiful thing in your world. "Mrs. Boone, if this court were to annul your marriage today, what would you do?" The question she'd been dreading, the one that would reveal the true depth of her commitment. Josie wiped her eyes and looked directly at Judge Morrison. "I would ask my husband to marry me again, not for legal convenience, not for financial security, but because I choose him, because he's become the home I didn't know I was looking for." The courtroom was absolutely silent now, every person riveted by the raw honesty of her testimony. Even Weatherby seemed stunned by the transformation of the woman he'd dismissed as a fortune hunter. When Hutchins rose to cross-examine, his usual arrogance had been replaced by careful calculation. "Mrs. Boone, you've painted a very romantic picture of your marriage's evolution. But the fact remains that it began as a business transaction, correct?" "Yes." "And without your financial difficulties, you would never have approached Mr. Boone, correct?" "Probably not." "And without his inheritance requirements, he would never have proposed marriage to a virtual stranger, correct?" Josie considered this carefully. "I don't know. I'd like to think that somehow, somewhere, we would have found each other anyway. But your right circumstances brought us together. So you admit that your marriage was founded on mutual need rather than mutual affection?" "Yes, but I would argue that many of the best partnerships begin that way. My parents' marriage was arranged by their families for practical reasons. They grew to love each other deeply over 40 years together." Josie lifted her chin defiantly. "The beginning of a story doesn't determine its ending, Mr. Hutchins. What matters is what people choose to build together." When the testimony concluded, both attorneys delivered their closing arguments. Hutchins focused on the legal technicalities, the suspicious timing, the clear financial motivations. Bradley spoke of transformation, of love that grew from practical beginnings into something profound and genuine. But it was Judge Morrison's words that would determine their fate. "This court has heard compelling testimony on both sides," he began, his weathered face grave with the weight of decision. "The plaintiff has demonstrated that the Boone marriage began as a practical arrangement between two people facing difficult circumstances. The defendants have shown that this arrangement evolved into something deeper and more genuine. Josie held her breath, Elias's hand tight in hers. However, the question before this court is not whether love can grow from practical beginnings. Clearly it can. The question is whether territorial law recognizes marriages entered into primarily for legal or financial advantage. The pause felt eternal. After careful consideration of all testimony and evidence, this court finds that while the Boone marriage may have begun as a marriage of convenience, it has demonstrably evolved into a genuine marital relationship characterized by mutual affection, shared responsibilities, and emotional intimacy. Relief flooded through Josie like warm honey. Furthermore, Judge Morrison continued, the revelation that the plaintiff's legal standing to bring this challenge was based on fraudulent documentation calls into question not only his right to contest the marriage, but his motives for doing so. Weatherby was slumping in his chair, his face ashen with defeat. Therefore, this court denies the plaintiff's petition to annul the marriage of Elias and Josephine Boone. The marriage is declared valid and binding, and all challenges to Mr. Boone's inheritance rights are dismissed. The gavel fell with a sharp crack that seemed to echo through the suddenly erupting courtroom. People were cheering, clapping, reaching across the aisle to congratulate the vindicated couple. Thomas Whitmore was nowhere to be seen. He'd slipped out during the closing arguments, finally accepting that his childhood sweetheart had chosen a different path. But for Josie, the noise faded to background whispers as Elias pulled her into his arms, their kiss witnessed by half the territory and blessed by the full weight of the law. "Mrs. Boone," he murmured against her lips, "I believe we just scandalized Montana." "Good," she whispered back, laughing through her tears. "I told you this marriage was worth gossiping about." They had won more than a legal victory. They had proven to themselves and the world that love could triumph over suspicion, that genuine affection could grow from the most practical beginnings, and that sometimes the best marriages were built not on passion alone, but on the solid foundation of two people choosing each other, day after day, with full knowledge of what they were getting. Outside the courthouse, as they walked toward their wagon in the golden afternoon light, Elias stopped suddenly. "Josie," he said, reaching into his vest pocket, "I have something for you." He pulled out a folded paper fresh and clean, unlike the legal documents that had dominated the past few days. When she unfolded it, she saw it was a new marriage certificate, blank, except for their names written in Elias's careful hand. "What's this?" "A promise," he said simply, "that someday soon, when all this legal business is behind us, I'd like to marry you again. Properly this time, with vows that mean everything and nothing held back." Josie looked at the certificate, then at the man who'd become her husband, her partner, her home. The document was just paper, but it represented something precious, the chance to choose each other freely, without desperation or legal requirements driving their decision. "Yes," she said, her voice strong and sure. "Yes, I'd like that very much." As they drove home toward the ranch that was legally and truly theirs, Josie reflected on the strange journey that had brought them to this moment. It had begun with begging at a stranger's gate, continued through months of careful politeness and growing affection, and culminated in a courtroom where they defended not just their legal status, but their love itself. They had won. Not just the case, but something far more valuable, the certainty that what they'd built together was worth fighting for, worth defending, worth choosing over and over again for all the years to come. Spring arrived early that year, bringing with it the sweet scent of prairie flowers and the gentle warmth that made Montana's harsh winters seem like distant memories. Josie stood in her kitchen garden, watching the first green shoots push through the dark soil, with the determined optimism that had carried her through the hardest year of her life. The legal battles were behind them now, faded into courthouse records and fading gossip. Marcus Weatherby had left the territory in disgrace, his fraudulent schemes exposed and his reputation in ruins. Thomas Whitmore had returned to Boston with a polite letter from Josie, wishing him well in finding the kind of love that would make him as happy as she'd found with Elias. But it was the smaller changes that meant the most to Josie as she surveyed her domain on this perfect May morning. The flower boxes that lined the kitchen windows, overflowing with the hardy blooms that thrived in Montana's challenging climate. The rocking chair by the front window, where she spent peaceful evenings watching the sunset paint the grassland in shades of gold and rose. The hand-carved cradle that now sat in their bedroom, no longer Elias's room and her room, but the space they shared as husband and wife in every sense of the word. The cradle was Elias's latest project, crafted during the long winter evenings with the same patient attention he brought to everything he truly cared about. It sat waiting, hopeful and beautiful, for the child they both wanted but hadn't yet been blessed with. Dr. Patterson had assured them that such things took time, that their love was young, even if their marriage was nearly a year old. Patience, the kindly physician had counseled during his last visit. The good Lord's timing isn't always our timing, but it's always perfect. Josie touched her still flat stomach with a secret smile. Dr. Patterson's timing might be more perfect than he knew. She'd been fighting morning sickness for a week now, though she hadn't yet shared her suspicions with Elias. She wanted to be certain before raising hopes that had already weathered too much disappointment. "Admiring your empire?" Elias's voice came from behind her, warm with the affectionate teasing that had replaced his former careful politeness. She turned to find him watching her from the kitchen doorway, his sleeves rolled up and flour dusting his forearms. He'd been experimenting with bread baking lately, claiming that ranch wives shouldn't bear all the domestic burdens alone. The results were sometimes questionable, but his determination was endearing. "Just thinking about how different everything looks from a year ago," she said, walking into his open arms. "Better different or worse different?" "Much, much better." She stood on her toes to kiss him, tasting flour and morning coffee on his lips. "How's the bread coming?" "Well, it's definitely bread-shaped. Whether it's edible remains to be seen." Their laughter mingled in the warm kitchen air, the comfortable sound of two people who'd learned to find joy in ordinary moments. This was what marriage was supposed to be. Josie thought not the desperate bargain they'd made in desperation, but this easy partnership built on mutual respect and growing love. "Elias," she said, settling into the rhythm of their morning routine, "I have something to tell you." Something in her tone made him look up sharply from the coffee he was pouring. "Good something or bad something?" "Wonderful something. At least, I think it's wonderful." She watched understanding dawn in his grey eyes, saw hope and fear and joy chase each other across his weathered features. Without saying a word, he set down the coffee pot and crossed to where she sat, kneeling beside her chair like a supplicant before an altar. "Are you sure?" "As sure as I can be without Dr. Patterson's confirmation, but all the signs are there." Elias rested his forehead against her knees, his large hands gentle on her waist. When he looked up, there were tears in his eyes, not of sadness, but of gratitude, so profound it took her breath away. "I never thought after Sarah, after losing them both, I never imagined I'd have another chance at this." "We're having this chance," Josie corrected gently, "together." He rose and pulled her into his arms, holding her with the careful reverence of a man who'd learned that the most precious things in life were also the most fragile. They stood together in their kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of the life they'd built, the bread cooling on the counter, the wildflowers in their mason jar vase, the morning light streaming through windows that finally looked out on a home instead of just a house. "When?" he asked. "Late fall, if Dr. Patterson's calculations are right. A harvest baby. Perfect timing. We'll have the summer to prepare, and by the time the little one arrives, the worst of the winter work will be done." They spent the morning making plans, discussing nursery arrangements and necessary preparations with the practical efficiency that characterized all their major decisions. But beneath the logistics, Josie could see the wonder in Elias's face, the way he kept glancing at her, as if she might disappear if he looked away too long. That afternoon, as they worked together in the barn, Josie organizing tack, while Elias repaired a broken stall door, she found herself thinking about the strange journey that had brought them to this moment of perfect contentment. A year ago, she'd stood at this ranch's gate as a desperate woman with nothing to offer but her willingness to work. Now she was the mistress of this thriving operation, partner to a man who'd shown her that love didn't always announce itself with grand gestures and passionate declarations. Sometimes it grew quietly, like the wild flowers she pressed between the pages of her mother's Bible, taking root in the most unlikely soil and blooming into something more beautiful than anything that could have been planned. "I've been thinking," Elias said as he tested the repaired hinge, "about what you said in court, about asking me to marry you again if the judge had ruled against us. What about it? I'd like to take you up on that offer." Josie looked up from the bridle she was mending, surprised by the sudden seriousness in his voice. "We're already married, Elias, as legally and thoroughly as two people can be." "I know, but I want to marry you again anyway. Not because we have to, not because of inheritance clauses or practical necessities, but because I choose you. Because I want the whole territory to see that Elias Boone is the luckiest man in Montana." The proposal for that's what it was, she realized, took her breath away. They'd already had one wedding, rushed and practical and overshadowed by desperation. Now he was offering her another chance, an opportunity to celebrate their love instead of simply formalizing their arrangement. "When?" she asked, her heart racing with excitement. "Soon. Before you start showing, while we can still scandalize the neighbors with a proper celebration." He set down his tools and crossed to where she sat, taking her hands in his work, roughened ones. "I want to dance with my wife at our wedding, Josie. I want to hear the preacher say the words while I'm looking at you and thinking about how grateful I am instead of how scared I am." "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I would love to marry you again." The second wedding of Elias and Josephine Boone took place on the first Saturday in June, in the meadow behind their ranch house, where the grass grew thick and wildflowers painted the landscape in brilliant colors. Half the territory seemed to be in attendance, out of obligation this time, but out of genuine affection for the couple who'd become something of a local legend. Josie wore a dress of pale yellow silk that she'd ordered specially from Denver, with wildflowers in her hair and her mother's pearl earrings catching the afternoon sunlight. Elias stood beneath an arch of prairie roses and Indian paintbrush, wearing his best suit and a smile that could have lit the entire Montana sky. This time, when Reverend Matthews asked if they would love, honor, and cherish each other for all the days of their lives, their "I do" rang out clear and strong, spoken not from desperation but from deep certainty. When Elias kissed his bride, the cheers from their guests could probably be heard in the next county. The celebration lasted well into the evening, with dancing and music and enough food to feed a small army. Mrs. Henderson had outdone herself with the wedding cake, a 3-layer confection decorated with sugar flowers that looked almost too beautiful to eat. Jake Morrison had surprised everyone by producing a fiddle and leading the makeshift band with unexpected skill. As the sun set over the Montana grassland, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Josie found herself in Elias's arms for their first dance as a twice-married couple. The music was simple, the dance floor was rough prairie grass, but she'd never felt more elegant or more cherished. "Any regrets?" Elias asked as they swayed together beneath the stars. "Only one," she said, smiling up at him. "What's that?" "That it took us so long to get here, that we wasted months being polite strangers when we could have been falling in love. We weren't ready then. We had to learn to trust each other first, to see past our own fears and expectations." He spun her gently, her yellow dress flaring around her ankles. "Besides, I like our story. It's not like anyone else's." "No," Josie agreed, thinking of all the romance novels she'd read as a girl, with their tales of love at first sight and grand romantic gestures. "It's not. It's better." As the evening wound down and their guests began to make their way home, Josie and Elias walked hand in hand to the small cemetery behind the church, where Sarah and her baby lay beneath a simple stone marker. It had become their tradition, this quiet pilgrimage to acknowledge the love that had come before, and to honor the woman who'd helped shape the man Josie had fallen in love with. "I brought her flowers," Josie said, kneeling to place a bouquet of prairie roses on the grave. "I thought she should know about the baby, about how happy we are." Elias knelt beside her, his voice soft in the gathering darkness. "She would have liked you, you know. Would have been glad I found someone who could see past all my rough edges to the man underneath." "I think she knew," Josie said simply. "I think that's why she made you promise to be happy again. She knew you'd find your way back to love eventually." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars emerge in the vast Montana sky. The night was warm and peaceful, full of the promise of summer days and harvest months, and the baby who would arrive with the first snow. When they finally made their way back to the ranch house, Josie paused on the front porch to look out over the land that had become her world. The meadow where they'd been married was still decorated with paper lanterns that glowed like fallen stars. The barn where she'd first seen Elias gentle a frightened horse stood solid and welcoming in the moonlight. The corrals held cattle that represented prosperity and security, but more than that, they held the fruits of partnership and shared dreams. "Happy?" Elias asked, following her gaze across their domain. "Happier than I ever imagined possible." She turned to face him, this man who'd become her husband, her partner, her home. "A year ago, I thought happiness was something that happened to other people, in other stories. I never dreamed it could happen to someone like me." "Someone like you?" "Someone ordinary. Someone who'd spent her whole life taking care of other people, never expecting to be taken care of in return." Elias cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away tears she hadn't realized were falling. "Josie Boone, there is nothing ordinary about you. You're the woman who saw beauty in pressed flowers and broken furniture. You're the one who looked at a bitter, lonely man and saw someone worth saving. You turned a house full of ghosts into a home full of laughter. We did that together." "Yes," he agreed, his voice warm with satisfaction. "We did." Inside their house, their home, the evidence of their celebration was scattered throughout the rooms. Wedding gifts sat waiting to be unwrapped, including a beautiful quilt from the ladies' church circle and a matched set of china from Dr. Patterson. But the most precious gift was the one they'd given each other, the chance to choose love over fear, partnership over solitude, hope over despair. As they prepared for bed in the room they now shared without awkwardness or careful politeness, Josie caught sight of herself in the mirror. She looked different from the desperate woman who'd begged for work at Elias's gate just over a year ago. Her face was fuller, her eyes brighter, her whole bearing more confident. This was what love did. She realized it didn't just change how you felt, it changed who you were. "Do you think our baby will be happy here?" she asked, as they settled into bed, her head on Elias's shoulder. "I think our baby will be the luckiest child in Montana," he said, his hand resting gently on her still flat stomach. "Two parents who know how precious love is, because we almost didn't find it. A ranch that's been in the family for 3 generations, and enough space to grow into whatever kind of person they want to become. And enough wildflowers to press between the pages of every book in the territory. Definitely that." They lay in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds of their ranch, the distant lowing of cattle, the whisper of wind through grass, the soft hooting of an owl in the cottonwood trees by the creek. These were the sounds of home, of safety, of a life built on solid foundations and sustained by love that had grown stronger with each passing day. "Elias," Josie said softly, "thank you." "For what?" "For asking me to marry you that first day, for seeing something in me that I didn't even know was there, for being patient while I learned how to be loved. Thank you for saying yes, for staying when you could have left with Thomas, for fighting for us when it would have been easier to give up." "I'd do it all again," she said firmly. "Every difficult day, every moment of uncertainty, every challenge we faced. It was all worth it to get to this." "So would I." Outside their window, the Montana night stretched endlessly toward the horizon, full of stars and possibilities and the quiet promise of tomorrow. In the barn, the horses settled into sleep. In the pastures, cattle dozed beneath the watchful eyes of a moon that had seen countless love stories play out on this ancient land. But few of those stories, Josie thought as sleep began to claim her, had been quite like theirs. Few had begun with such desperate practicality and blossomed into such profound joy. Few had survived the challenges they'd faced, or grown stronger because of them. She and Elias had started as strangers, bound by necessity, and transformed themselves into partners joined by choice. They'd built a love story worth defending in court, worth celebrating with the whole territory, worth passing down to the children who would someday run through these same fields and sleep beneath these same stars. As she drifted off to sleep in her husband's arms, surrounded by the evidence of their shared life and dreaming of the future they would build together, Josie Mallory Boone knew with absolute certainty that sometimes the most beautiful love stories were the ones that began with the simplest words. "Please take me. I'll do anything. Will you marry me?" Yes. Always yes.